Good evening. Let me welcome you all on this crisp autumn day here in Las Vegas. I'm Bill Brown with Brookings Mountain West. Thanks for coming out tonight. You're in for a treat. I try not to spoil any of Richard's surprises, but we're delighted to have Richard Reeves with us tonight. Let me, little housekeeping. Let me say that Richard's PowerPoint is already up on our Brookings Mountain West website. So for you note takers in the audience, don't feel too strained. You'll have that to refer to if you need to. And the recording will be up in a few days as well. And for those of you who've been with us for any part of our 5 years, you may or may not have met our office manager, Alexandra Nikolic, who makes everything happen here at Brookings. And she's about to leave us in spite of our best efforts for another job at UNLV. That's the only reason we're actually letting her go. But I will be back to announce a lecture next week. I'm just not sure that we'll actually pull it off without Alex here. We'll have to figure out how. Let me also, before I introduce Richard, thank the Greenspun College of Urban Affairs, who co-sponsors our lectures with us. We are quite obviously sitting in Greenspun Hall, and it's a great venue, and we appreciate their support. I'm going to get to the business of introducing our speaker tonight and get out of the way. Richard Reeves comes to us from Brookings. He's making his first visit to us as a visiting scholar, but we've already put him hard at work. He's met with a number of students and classes at UNLV, still has a few more to go this week. He's going to present, I think, some fascinating information and posit his view on a very important topic, and that is the American dream. And as we were talking this afternoon, I don't think there's a more appropriate place to be discussing this topic except in one of America's most diverse cities, getting more diverse by the day, and at one of America's most diverse public universities. If this institution and we are not about helping people fulfill their version of the American dream, I'm not sure what we're doing here. So I'm privileged to bring my colleague Richard Reeves up. I hope you can understand his accent. Richard has written and published on this topic. I won't go through his long litany, but he's had a career in journalism, in politics, and now as a policy expert at Brookings. Richard?
We're either in a sci-fi movie or there's something going on with the mic. Did that stop? Is it where I stand? Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak. It's an honor to be here. Let me thank Bill and Alex for organizing this lecture and this whole week. The faculty who've invited me to speak in their classes and the students who've engaged. And I'd also like to thank particularly the students who are here tonight, controlling the equipment, recording, webcasting, etc. I really appreciate the effort that you're going to, particularly as it's so late. And I recognize it's a bit later in the evening maybe than some people are used to, so I'm going to try and keep the regression analyses down to a minimum. There are some graphs, there is data, but there are also some interactive features to this presentation as well. I very often start by apologizing for my accent and my nationality. I spend a lot of time talking about class and inequality in America, and I do it in this very obviously not American accent. So I was going to apologize for that, and I'll offer my usual defense, which is I love America. It's the second time I've lived here. I'm now a permanent resident. I've married an American. My children are American citizens, and I was born on the 4th of July. Okay, I'm not making that up. I was actually born on the 4th of July. So I consider myself American because of that. But then I thought I don't need to apologize because of the data that Bill just referred to, which is that there are fewer people in Vegas who are from Nevada than from overseas anyway. So actually, in this mountain melting pot, maybe this is a place where I don't need to apologize for the fact that I'm from overseas, whereas everywhere else I do. I'm going to talk about some subjects that greatly interest me and how they intersect, and in particular the issues of social mobility, intergenerational mobility, opportunity, and the American dream, and how that intersects with another interest of mine, which is in the development of character strengths and a kind of particular set of skills and the growing literature that there is around all of that. And I'm going to do that with help from Thomas Jefferson, Horatio Alger, John Stuart Mill, and also a pile of Lego bricks. So hopefully that will keep you going, and then we will have time for some questions as well. So this works great. So first of all, one of the things that occurs to me as I do my work here, and I work on, is kind of this phrase, the American dream. It's obviously used a great deal. It was popularized by Truslow Adams in the 1930s. It's in, I estimate, approximately 20% of every speech given by a politician in the United States. I can't verify that data, but let's just say it's 20%. Finding someone who's against the American dream is very difficult indeed. Everyone's in favor of it. The difficulty, I think, is in defining it. It's kind of what people mean by it, and people turn out to mean quite different things by it at different points or different political persuasions. Does it mean that everyone should share in rising prosperity? Which means that's a question of kind of the proceeds of growth, if you like. Is growth going, is it being spread widely? That's a kind of income inequality question. Is it about rising living standards? Is it just about making sure that everyone's getting better off over time to some degree, even if there are inequalities within them? Is it a strong middle class? Again, very hard to find a politician who's in favor of a weak middle class. Right? It's become a cliche to be in favor of a strong middle class, but what do we mean by that? And is that really what the American dream is? Is it that once you reach a certain distribution point in the distribution, you have to buy a house, look after your kids, etc.? Is that really what the American dream is? Or is it the eradication of poverty? Is it that actually in a kind of advanced society, the wealthiest country in the history of the world, that we shouldn't be witnessing the kind of poverty that we're seeing? Is it just fair treatment? Is it just actually these are the rules of the game? And as long as you kind of meet the rules of the game, that's what the American dream is. The American dream is about fair rules in a free market system. One of the things that strikes me as a kind of relative newcomer to the US is the kind of obsession with fairness, and particularly around sports, right? So the introduction of kind of video replays, first of all, means that every game, football game in particular, seems to take 8 hours, right? But it actually seems to be quite important. That actually, was that a touchdown or not, right? There was one tonight, I think it was a Redskins game or something. Anyway, and it's like catching the thing, the ball, that's it, the ball, catching the ball, and was his left heel down over that line before he was in control of the ball, right? 8 video replays from every different angle, 14 commentators, 15-minute delay. No one complains. No one thinks there's anything wrong with this. They just think, well, that's how it should. It was either a touchdown or it wasn't. We're going to apply the rules absolutely, right? And you see that in so many kinds of sporting events. That sense of, if you're going to win, you have to win according to fair rules is deeply, I think, in the American psyche. In Europe, if the ref says it was a touchdown, it was a touchdown, right? And they get it wrong half the time. And you really see it in the World Cup, right? In the Soccer World Cup. Well, the Americans are like, where's the video replay? Why aren't you? Clearly, it wasn't offside, right? Where's the replay? We don't have a replay, we just get on with the game. Whereas in America, of course, we couldn't do that. Is it about meritocracy? Is it about the sense that actually if you're meritorious, if you work hard, you're talented, you're bright, you're clever, you have a good idea, you just get very, very well rewarded for that? Is it about high rates of relative mobility? Is it actually about the fact that with each generation we just kind of resort society, right? That being born poor doesn't mean you stay poor, and being born at the top of the ladder doesn't mean you stay at the top of the ladder? Is it a fluid society with lots of movement? Which of these represents the American dream? And of course the answer is going to be a bit of all of them. The one I focus on in particular is the last of those, the issue of relative mobility. And I think I've got support from this guy, Horatio Alger. Right, so the Alger myth is kind of also part of the popular debate about this. You know, does the Alger myth exist or not? So this is from his most famous book, which was it's called Ragged Dick, Street Life of the Bootblacks, I think is a full title. And this is what Mr. Whitney says to the young Ragged Dick who goes on to become a gentleman as a result of the help, which is you can read it, but the kind of key point here is that just because you're born poor doesn't mean you can't advance, right? But look at what you have to do: save your money, buy books, and determine to be someone, right? So there's a whole series of hurdles that the Dick's going to have to clear in order to become the person he does become, which is a kind of successful merchant. Horatio Alger's books, although they were published in the 19th century, were the 5th best-selling books in American history in the year 2000, right? Better than Danielle Steele. Now you think what happened, right, in the 20th century to the population and to the number of books that were being sold, to still be the 5th best-selling author in American history in the year 2000 for a 19th century novelist was pretty good going. And it just shows you how big an impact he had. Of course, they were aimed at children. There was a kind of particular view of the world that was captured within his books. This is President Obama yesterday. He's signing something called the Declaration of the Promise Alliance. Behind him you can see Colin Powell, who is one of the, I think he's co-chair of the Promise Alliance. And you can see the quote here, and as I say, every president before him, and I'm sure every president after him will say something like this, which is this idea of the basic bargain. If you work hard and meet your responsibilities, you can get ahead no matter where you come from, right? I went to the awards ceremony of the Horatio Alger Society of Distinguished Americans, and I wrote about it in the Brookings essay that was published last month. And it was essentially this whole idea, right? There's a whole series of people who kind of, their stories were just incredible, having come from these difficult backgrounds and how they've kind of risen. And almost at the end of every speech, people would say, "Only in America." And I'd say, well, actually, the data's not quite that clear. It turns out it's more likely in Canada. And that was a very unpopular thing to say, because it is so kind of strongly part of the kind of psyche of America. And I argue that it goes a long way back. It's not just political rhetoric. It's not just an easy thing to say. It actually goes back to the founding of the nation. So I find myself reading some of the founding documents and reading some of the writings of the founders to try and get at where does this come from, how deeply rooted is it? And this is Jefferson, who kind of famously drafted the Declaration of Independence and famously said among the self-evident truths was that all men are created equal. We have a long debate, of course, about whether that was true. Actually, we can't have a very short debate. It wasn't at the time. But nonetheless, that sort of sense that all men were kind of created equal was right there from the beginning. That's not what Jefferson first wrote. When Jefferson first drafted the Declaration of Independence, he wrote this, that all men are created equal and independent. That was then edited out as the Declaration went through various revisions. But actually, I think that idea remained very strongly there from the founding, that they are created equal and independent. And it seems to me then that from the very beginning, America has squared the circle, if you like, of liberty and equality in its own particular way, which is to say we have this profound, almost unshakable belief that you're born equal, right? We have to do a big swerve around big parts of American history at that point, right? But that idea about being born equal, that actually quite radical idea of equality, certainly radical at the time, right? By contrast to Europe, where you're born into nobility, where you're born, where you have kind of hereditary ideas, right? The idea of hereditary anything was anathema to Americans from the beginning, because all men are created equal, and independent, right? So you weren't supposed to be a member of a class, or a race, or a guild, or a village, or whatever, but you were your own person. You were created not only equal, but independent. And I think that the combination of those two ideas of kind of egalitarianism, equality, and individualism came together. And so I describe that kind of philosophy of American as kind of individualist egalitarianism, which is not really a very good phrase, not one to conjure with. But I think it's been there from the very beginning. And it explains why, if we don't have this sense that people are equally able to lead independent lives, to rise, as the president said and Horatio Alger's fictional character said, if that's not true, if it starts to feel it's not true, that we're kind of stuck and that there's less mobility, there's less movement, I don't think that that's just an inconvenient fact for America. I don't think that it's something that challenges just the American dream to the extent that it's captured by this idea of mobility. On my reading of American history anyway, if it becomes not true that you can be equal and independent, you can rise, that there is fluidity, that birth is not destiny, that neither wealth nor poverty are inherited, if that ceases to feel or be true, that is threatening to the very idea of America itself, and an idea of America that has been there from the beginning. Now, the only way to show that properly, of course, is using Lego. So that's Jefferson would definitely do it this way if he was alive today. We're going to talk about inequality and opportunity in America. Let's start by dividing the population up into 5 equally sized slices. If you're boring like me, you might call them quintiles. In an absolutely equal society where everybody had the same amount of money, each fifth of the distribution would get a fifth of the money. It would look like this. Of course, that's not how it is. In the real world, the bottom quintile, the bottom fifth, gets 5% of the money, and the top fifth get more than half the money. But I think in terms of fairness, and certainly in terms of American fairness, the question's less what's the gap between the bottom and the top, and it's more what are your chances of making it from the bottom to the top? How mobile is society? How far does where you're born on the ladder affect where you end up on the ladder? So in a perfectly mobile society, an opportunity utopia, being born down here in the bottom quintile would have no effect on where you ended up. You'd be equally likely to make it to the top as to stay at the bottom. But now I want to show you what it's really like. Right now, for the people born at the bottom, more than 1 in 3 of them will remain stuck at the bottom, and just 1 in 10 are going to make it all the way up to the top. That's bad enough, but it's even worse for certain groups in the population. If you were born in the bottom quintile and you're a black American, you have a 50% chance of remaining stuck at the bottom and just a 3% chance of making it Horatio Alger style all the way to the top. So this is the picture for black America. For white Americans, the picture looks close to that utopia with roughly the same chances of making it to the top of the distribution as of being stuck at the bottom. Those who are born at the bottom and are raised by parents who are never married. And for that group, the odds of making it to the top are pretty slim as well. For them, it looks like this. For those raised by married parents, it looks like this. Again, it's pretty close to what you might hope for in a perfectly mobile society. Those who are born at the bottom, if they're raised by married parents, have a pretty good chance of making it to the top. So if you don't complete high school, there's a 50% chance you're going to stay stuck at the bottom if you were born at the bottom, and a 1% chance that you're going to make it to the top 20% of the income distribution as an adult yourself. So for them, it looks like this. If you're born at the bottom, born in this bottom fifth, but you're one of the few born down here who managed to get a 4-year college degree, transforms your chances of moving up the income distribution. Go to college. We can have a long argument about the gap between the rich and the poor, but I think we can all agree that we don't want to live in a society where you're born determines so strongly your chances in life of where you end up. America has a dream of equal opportunity, and we're a very long way right now from that dream. We have a big problem, and we need big solutions. Okay, so first thing is to tell you that I have a wager with a friend of mine who has a video on YouTube as well as to who can get the most views by the end of the year. I'm obviously not going to tell you what his video is, because you might go and look at it. But I'm going to tell you that there's a very expensive dinner that's in play. Okay, so if any of you feel moved to share that on Twitter or Facebook or with your friends or whatever, or run around public libraries watching it from lots of different computers, then I'm not going to stop you. That was obviously a radical simplification in 3 minutes using Lego of the story. And what's lost in simplification, I'll be able to come on to in a moment. One thing that's lost, and I would probably do the race gap slightly differently now, because although, so we show better mobility patterns for white than some other studies, although honestly the black-white mobility gaps are simply huge. But it gives the impression, because I'm only looking at movement from that bottom quintile, I'm not looking at the top quintile, I'm not looking at downward mobility or the rest of the distribution. And it's still true that there's a lot of persistence at the top for both white and black Americans. It's not true that there's lots of downward mobility for white Americans. And we can obviously talk more about that as we go through. And the other thing that happens in there is that I contrast the marriage point is never married parents against continuously married parents, right? So these are parents who are married throughout your childhood. And it's true, and those patterns hold pretty strongly, that if you are born in that bottom 20% and your parents are continuously married, or your mother is continuously married, that's the data we have, throughout that time, then you do have very, very good upward mobility prospects. However, there are lots and lots of correlations between these things, right? That's just the raw data. So that all we're doing at that point is describing. One of the most important findings in the last 2 years in social mobility is the huge geographical variation within the United States. So previously we'd do a lot of international comparisons to Canada, to Denmark, to the UK, etc., to see how we fare. And the US doesn't do very well on those international comparisons as a whole society. And I've just shown you data for the whole of the US in that video. But the work of Raj Chetty at Harvard and the Equal Opportunity Project has now been able to use a high quality data set to look at different cities in particular and different parts of the United States. And it turns out that some parts of the United States have very high levels of mobility, Scandinavian levels of mobility. Salt Lake City, Utah looks a lot like some of the best, most mobile countries in the world. At the other end of the scale, cities like Atlanta and Charlotte have very, very low rates of mobility indeed. So you see more variation within the US than between countries, and I think that's where a lot of the action is going to be. And actually, this is from Chetty's paper. This is a list of the 50, they're not all on there, but the 50 largest metro areas in the US, ranked by their mobility. The rank here is for absolute upward mobility, but you can see it also shows you different measures of mobility across. And I kind of put that up because Vegas is number 31. So of the top 50, in terms of size, metro areas, that was size when they had the data. It ranked kind of 31. So somewhere in the middle, effectively. You can see that the better scoring ones are Salt Lake City, but then some of the Midwestern towns do pretty well. And then as you kind of move to the bottom, you're going to get a lot of states, cities from the south. That's where the kind of mobility rates tend to be lowest. So geographical variation is important. I want to talk a bit about college before moving on to talk about character. One of the most important messages from all this research is that skills matter. Right? Skills are what help people to move up. And skills obviously come in different shapes and sizes and are often represented by education. So this is data from Ron Haskins, who's a frequent visitor here and my close colleague at Brookings, which fleshes out the Lego video on higher education and college and the effect that has on distribution. So these are quintile transition matrices. I know, and I promised not to have too much boring stuff. But these are like the tools of our trade in some ways, because what they show us is, look at where you're born, splitting you up into those equal fifths, and then your chance and where you end up as an adult, right? So what this is telling me is that for those without a college degree, 45% of those who are born in the bottom 20% stay there, just 5% make it to the top. Whereas, and this is similar to this different data set, similar to data in the video, if you have a college degree, you're on a 16% chance of being stuck at the bottom and a 19% chance of making to the top. So if you're born into the poorest fifth of the income distribution and you get a 4-year college degree, you're more likely to get to the top of the ladder than stay at the bottom. Now, so what you can see from that is that the possession of a college degree, these are different, almost like different countries in terms of their mobility patterns. But you can also see that even allowing for that within each of those, so let's call it the two Americas, the college educated and the non-college educated, and I think that's not an unfair description in some ways now. You can see that there's still a lot of persistence. So let's look at these are now the non-college graduates. Look at the ones born at the top. 23% of them stay there. More of them stay there than fall to the bottom. So even though they don't have a college degree, just being born at the top is doing an awful lot to keep them up there. And then for those who are fortunate enough to be born at the top and who get a 4-year college degree, 54% of them will stay in the top 20% of the income distribution, whereas if this was being done in a perfectly mobile way, only 20% would, and just 2% fall to the bottom. So college hugely changes the mobility pattern, but let's not kid ourselves, there isn't huge persistence even within those two populations, because there is. Now, what this doesn't tell you is how many people in each of those groups is getting a college degree. It just tells me what their chances are of moving up or down if they're in there. It doesn't tell me anything about the kind of quantum, the size involved. And I'm just going to show some work from, this is from Susan Dynarski and Martha Bailey's work. And it's a slight, I apologize because education researchers use quartiles, not quintiles, right? I apologize, it's just annoying. So whereas I was doing quintiles, this is quartiles. So we've now split the population up into four equally sized slices rather than 5. Don't ask me why it's different, but it is. Anyway, so this is the same, so poorest across to the richest. And then the two lines represent different birth cohorts. So these people here, this line are people who are born between 61 and 64. Okay, so the people who are even older than I am. And these people are people who are born between 79 and 82, who are absurdly young, right? So those are the birth cohorts. So this is the most recent, this is the younger. And you can see everyone's more likely to go to college, right? So more people are going to college. That's the message. The fact that that line is high just tells us more people are going to college. But as you move up the income distribution, the chances of them having completed college obviously go up. And they go up quite sharply. Now what I've done here is to say, imagine as if the pattern across the first 3 quartiles was just extended to the 4th. So if this line just kind of continued mathematically up to the 4th quartile, then those are the numbers we'd expect from the richest quartile to have completed a 4-year college degree. Okay? Is everyone with me? Am I losing anyone? Is anyone wanting to rush out to get a drink? Okay. That's what it would look like if the line just kind of went forward. This is what it actually looks like. So there's something quite important going on here, which is that there's a disproportionate chance of the people who are in the top quarter of the income distribution by their background, by their parents' household income, completing a 4-year college degree compared to everybody else. So it goes up for everybody. Now, so what you can do is we can say to ourselves, look, people who are from the poorest quarter, the lowest income quarter, are twice as likely to go to college as they were in the earlier cohort. So we can feel pretty good about that. Just in isolation, that fact sounds pretty good. But then when you put it against the distribution, you might feel quite a bit less good about it. Because from an intergenerational mobility point of view, what I'm really worried about is the gap between the bottom and the top, and the middle and the top. And it's actually the gap between the majority and the top that's driving it. And I think that pattern is now to be found in lots of areas of life. Income inequality, wealth inequality, marriage rates, intendedness in childbearing, property values, education. You're seeing the kind of pulling away of the top from the majority. That's the subject of a separate lecture. But I think it can kind of show you that whilst we know that college matters, this is the real challenge. Unless we can flatten that line somewhat, unless we can improve the odds of people from the bottom completing college, then we're in trouble. And it's completion of college that's a real issue now, as much as enrollment. So it may have been that, certainly it was 15 years ago maybe, it would have been an enrollment challenge. Now it's more of a completion challenge. Of course there's still an enrollment challenge, but dropout rates are so high that it's actually finishing college that seems to be the distinguishing factor. So I put college up there. It's not the main theme of what I want to talk about. I'm now going to cover on to non-cognitive skills, but I want to put that up there because I don't want you to think that because I'm concentrating today on character and grit and so on, as if that's all that matters. I will say, however, that some of the skills I'm about to talk about are very important for completing college. So I don't think they're completely opposed to each other. Right, my hero and subject of biography by me is John Stuart Mill, the 19th century liberal philosopher. And I'm going to talk now about the character strength of prudence, the ability to defer gratification, to think about the future, to put enough value on your future self to stop your present self from doing something really stupid or wasteful. Right, that capacity being very important for life success. And this was Mill in 1861. Men often reach for the nearer good, what he means one that's here today, even though they know it to be the less valuable. There's the tragedy. Even though they know it to be less valuable, we know we shouldn't eat that donut, right? We know we should be going for a run instead of eating that dessert, right? Vegas is like the worst place to give this talk, right? If people listen to Mill, then the entire economy would collapse. But there is a kind of ability just to moderate, right? You don't want to become a Puritan, right? And you just absolutely, you're always thinking about tomorrow, right? You don't want that. But on the other hand, balancing the needs of our future self against our present self turns out to be an incredibly important life skill. So in psychology experiments, people say, take some money, right? Do you want, let's do this for real, okay? So I'm going to give you the choice. I'm going to give you $100 today or $110 a week from now. Okay, let's say this is live. I've actually got $100 in my pocket. I actually do have $5 somewhere. Right, say I've got $100, right. $100 today or $110 in a week. Hands up who take $100 now. Hands up if you take $100 now. And is willing to admit it when you know where I'm going with this line of argument. Thank you. Thank you for your honesty. So would I. Who would take 110 in a week? Right. Congratulations. You are among the successful, boring people. All right, different question. Would you take $100 in 4 weeks or $110 in 5 weeks? Okay. Who would take 100? So there's a choice now. You have to wait 4 weeks for $100, or you have to wait 5 weeks for $110. Who's going to take $100 in 4 weeks now? Hands up. Just one. Okay, we're going to have to do a whole separate intervention with you. And who would wait 5 weeks for 110? Right. Okay. So economists call that hyperbolic discounting. Right. There's no reason why actually. Half of you said, if I have to wait a week, I'm not going to wait a week, I'll take the $100 now. But when I suddenly pushed it out to the future and made you wait between 4 and 5 weeks, you're just like, oh, that's in the future. Right? You didn't think about it between 4 and 5 weeks, right? So the curve goes like that. So you're discounting your future in a very, very hyperbolic way, to use the technical language, right? Do you want one marshmallow now? If I give you a marshmallow now, do you want it now? Or how about 2 in 15 minutes' time? Okay, all you've got to do is wait 15 minutes. You have 2 marshmallows. Does anybody know about the marshmallow test? Hands up who's heard of the marshmallow test. Right. Right. Huh?
It's been published 100 times.
Yeah, right. It has. So for those who don't know about it, Walter, Michelle, you take 4-year-olds, you give them a marshmallow, and you say, here's a marshmallow. You can eat it if you want, or if you wait 15 minutes, I'll bring you another one, and then you can have 2. And then you see which children are able to wait. Follow-up studies show that the kids who are able to wait were much more likely to graduate high school, found a job, stayed out of trouble, less likely to become a teen parent, etc., etc. Right? So a whole series of good things flowed from their ability to defer gratification. So the conclusion of the research was, even at 4, the capacity to kind of defer that gratification predicts later success. They engaged in various strategies. They'd look away, they'd kind of, they'd frame it differently, they'd turn. The kids used lots of different strategies to wait. Only a third of them were able to wait, by the way. 2/3 of them ate it, and some of them ate it when there was only like 30 seconds to go, which is really tragic. But there's been a replication of this study, right? So here's the kind of danger, right? Because don't eat the marshmallow has now become pretty well known, right? Well, the replication of the study was done a couple of years ago, did exactly the same study, but added crayons. And this time round, they took the kids and they gave them all some broken crayons. This was not part of the test, as far as the kids knew. This was just while they were killing time before doing the test. And they said to them, these are a bit broken, I'll bring you some better ones, I'll bring you some new ones. All right, bring you some new crayons. They gave half the kids new crayons, and they said to the other half of the kids, I'm really sorry we didn't have any new crayons. Yeah, these are all we've got. Then they ran the marshmallow test. And those results blew the previous results out of the water. What they found was the kids who'd been promised crayons and got them waited for the marshmallow. The kids who'd been promised crayons and didn't get crayons didn't wait for the marshmallow. This makes perfect sense. They didn't trust the adult anymore. They said, hang on, he's the guy that promised me crayons. I'm not waiting for his marshmallow. 15 minutes, he's gone. I better eat this, right? Now, so I think that's actually, it was a small study, as was the original, but I think that's quite important. Because there's a danger that the original study gets interpreted as some people just have the character strength of, they're born with it, right? The ability to resist the marshmallow, right? And then they do well. Well, no. First of all, there's a whole series of skills you can acquire that help you to resist the marshmallow. Second of all, one of the reasons why you do resist temptation in the short term is because of a reliable payoff in the long run. It has to feel likely to you as if there will be a reliable payoff, right? It has to be worth it to you. Right? If you know you've only got a year to live, you're going to eat the donut, right? The only reason you don't eat the donut is because you think, oh, well, I might live and I better look after myself. And so, whilst it's certainly true that the development of these character strengths will help people to seize opportunities, it is also the case that the presence of real opportunity is an incentive for developing those character strengths. There is simply no point developing the skill of deferring gratification unless it feels as if it is worth it. Why finish a college degree unless you feel as if a college degree is valuable to you, as if it's going to make for a better career, higher earnings, better life, etc. If you start to doubt the future promise. And that's why we have to be very careful when you turn to kind of particularly people in low income situations. and assume that they're being irrational in the choices that they're making, because actually, given the circumstances they're in, they may well be acting relatively rationally because their life chances are not that great in the first place. So character builds opportunity, but opportunity builds character. This is from Jim Heckman is essentially the economist who's changed the subject around character studies. And this is from a very famous study, Perry Preschool. It was a kind of very high quality flagship preschool program. Some of you will know it, I know Ramona will. And what it found was that people who went through this Perry Preschool program did much better in life. They ended up with higher earnings, they were more likely to be in stable relationships, they're more likely to have graduated college, etc. But it wasn't because the kids were smarter, at least in terms of measured IQ. What you're seeing here is the kids that went through Perry, which is the top line, and the kids that didn't go through Perry, and they were randomly assigned. So it's a random assignment, right? And what you find is, look at the impact at the different ages on their IQ. So when they first go in, they just suddenly, these kids become like superheroes in terms of their brains overnight. And then over time, it kind of wears off, and by the time they hit age 10, the gap's closed. So the kids who went through Perry were no smarter, at least measuring this, using this measure of IQ, than the kids who didn't go through Perry. So their future success was not explained by their smarts in that sense. They hadn't got smarter, right? You saw that jump, but then it leveled off. Why did they do better? This has not come out very well, I apologize. Well, there's this whole separate series of measures, but the main one has, which is there was a measure of academic motivation in the study. It was teacher reports, subject to various biases. But what they did see is that in the group that went through Perry, huge increase in their motivation and their ability to stay on task and finish their work. So they weren't smarter, but they were finishing their work. They were sticking with it. And that stick-with-itness seems to be the thing that predicted their later success. Because very often completing an educational task requires as much stick-with-itness or grit or persistence or ability to defer gratification as it does smarts, okay? So getting through college and getting good grades in college, as most of you will know, is not only about being super smart up here, it's about cracking the books when all your friends are heading out to party. That is a very difficult thing to do, and the ability to do it turns out to be very important. There is, in one of the longitudinal studies that we use, the NLSY, something called the coding speed test. This was introduced as a kind of measure of administrative ability. And this is it. This is an example of how the test works. So what they did was they gave a series of words, and then with a kind of number that goes with it. And then there's a whole series of questions which said you had to match them up, right? So if those things are there, you've probably all been able to answer this by now, right? And are wondering what the trick is. There's no trick, right? So if house is 4232, then house is 432, right? It's A. The answer is A. Okay, there's no brains involved, there's no cognitive ability involved, you don't have to be smart, but it goes on and on and on. It's absurdly easy, but it's spine-crackingly dull. It's very dull. The kids who kind of stuck with it have done much better in life when you control for everything else. So there's something about the ability to just stay on a task, even though it's not particularly cognitively challenging, which predicts their later success. So by accident, the coding speed test seems to be capturing something that's not captured by cognitive tests. Something about the ability, these are adolescents, so these are getting it between 15 and 18, their ability to just frankly plod through this task. The truth is that there's quite a lot of plodding through stuff in life and keeping plodding. And this test seemed to measure that. We've done a study where we basically used the coding speed test, this stick-with-itness test, and produced mobile transition matrices. So by now, hopefully, you know roughly what these are showing. And these are people who are top scorers, green. They're the ones who score in the top third of the coding speed test and the bottom third of the coding speed test. And then looked at their chances of moving up and down the income ladder. So just look at the bottom quintile. You can see that those who scored in the top third, pretty mobile. Those who scored in the bottom third, less mobile. Now, it's usually correlated with lots of other things that are going on. I'm not saying that that's the only thing that explains this different mobility pattern. But nonetheless, it's striking that if you just take those two, it has this big effect. Now, maybe that doesn't matter, because maybe it's evenly distributed across the population. Turns out that's not true. This is income quintiles again. This is the coding speed test. So for some reason, there's some overlap with cognitive ability, but it seems as if the kids at the top, through socialization or whatever, were just sticking with this spine-crackingly dull test, even though it wasn't very cognitively challenging. I'll skip that. That's somebody else's work. So we've done a bit of work, and this is work in progress, where we've taken what's called a hyperactivity scale. It's slightly misnamed, which is in the same survey, the NLSY. And these are the things that are in the scale, right? And these are the reports of mothers of their own children. And we get them when the kids are 5 or 6 or 10 and 11. So we get these reports of whether these kids are like this. Then what we've done is to kind of break them down depending on whether they score high or low on those in early and middle childhood. And we've just defined low and high as one standard deviation above or below. We didn't want to, that sounds arbitrary, but we didn't want to impose anything other than just a standard deviation. So that gives us that distribution. And then we put them together and said, okay, but some of them are going to be high in both, low in both, or low in middle in some. And a very, very small fraction are kind of low in one and high in another. Only 2%, we take them out of our analysis. And you can see the distribution. So you've got 7% who are just kind of always low on this scale, 14% are always high, and then distribution in the middle, right? So to the extent this is capturing something about concentration, staying on task, etc., then maybe it will predict something. Are there divides? This just takes those who are above 200% of the poverty line or below, and then looks at whether those who are below that line score lower on this BPI, and the answer is yes, they do. And then we look at some outcomes. So low levels of hyperactivity, in other words, high levels of concentration or grit, if you like, and then you can see the outcomes that come. This is from the early years. So we take the early years ones and we just run it through our model to say, all right, what happens? Do they graduate high school? Do they not get arrested? Do they manage not to get pregnant? Did they graduate college? And you see quite strong results. Again, it's just descriptive. Do middle years, similar. Interestingly, I think we probably see slightly bigger effect around arrests there. So these are now looking at what the scores are at 10 and 11. And that seems to predict some of the adolescent outcomes more strongly. But basically the story here is about education. There's something about it seemed to capture education. And this is the composite one where we do the ones that are always low, always high in the middle, and you see the same story. It's really primarily an education story. You can see effects on the other outcomes, but a very strong effect on education. Now, a huge caveat, of course, is if you look at those questions, they look almost designed to sort of capture a certain set of behaviors, right? So there's a danger here of a self-fulfilling prophecy. You know, maybe actually the fact that there's nothing wrong with the kids. It's the education system that's at fault, right? And it should adapt to the kids rather than the kids having to adapt to the education system. So I put that caveat on the table. There's a danger that that captures a set of behaviors which the education system then rewards. So you may be capturing that rather than anything else. Nonetheless, we then measured character strengths, measured by that scale, versus smarts. In other words, how people did on a cognitive reading test for math and reading. And just tried to see what's the effect on high school graduation. So this is having a positive effect, it's having a negative effect on high school graduation. What you basically find is some strong correlations with controls for everything else in the model, some quite strong correlations. So scoring well on reading really predicts your chances of graduating high school. So does math, but actually these non-cognitive skills measured by our composite measure are actually more powerful than math. So actually we can predict your chances of graduating high school more powerfully from our measure of non-cognitive skills, grit if you like, than from your math ability. And on the other side of it, if you're low on non-cognitive skills, that has about the same effect as being low on reading skills. There was no significant result for math. So it looks as if, certainly high school graduation, which I know is an issue here, that you need to look at that through the lens of non-cognitive as well as cognitive skills. Here are my final thoughts. Some of which I've covered already. The American dream is based on, I think, this idea of meritocratic movement, the circulation of elites, the idea that we don't inherit our status, we don't inherit our rung on the income ladder. I'd call that individualist egalitarianism, that we're born equal but responsible. On my reading, the US is falling short of that dream. Relative mobility rates aren't high enough, if that's the idea. Among the skills that are necessary are character strengths as well as smarts. And so equal opportunity policy, if we're serious about equality, needs to take those skills into account, as well as the cognitive ones as well, and think about how those skills are developed. And then really my honestly final thought. Does this ideal of individualist egalitarianism that underpins the idea of equal opportunity rely not only on book smarts, but also on character strengths? Or to put it more succinctly, does the American dream require at least a certain dose of the frontier spirit? Thank you for your attention. Now.
Thank you, Richard. We have time for questions. Always my favorite part of the evening. Let me get out of the spotlight here. Who wants to start? I saw a lot of people nodding or raising. In front here, sir.
Yeah, I guess very, very interesting. And I noticed you did have a little bit of a category as to different time sequences. But of course, we always hear, well, Eisenhower 0 is the perfect middle class age, the 50s. even that there was some better conditions up until, say, 1980.
Right.
And then, of course, people are saying that this is exponentiating downward. And have you found that? And I guess then, you know, having grown up sort of in an industrial middle America town where there was just a lot of options as to where you could go, you know, with your education, what types you use, not just going to school, but, you know, going into a factory and learning on the job. What about correlations there too?
Good question. So the relative mobility that I talk mostly about appears to have been flat for at least half a century, if you believe the research. But that was, I think, disguised by the fact that absolute mobility was rising because of such rapid economic growth. So between 1950 and 1974, the US economy grew at 4% a year on average. So basically it was boom time, right? And what that meant was just more jobs were being created, more opportunities were being created, there was more room at the top. And so in a sense, the fact that you weren't having that kind of movement up and down the income ladder didn't matter so much because the whole ladder was being moved up. I think one of the things that's happening now is that as economic growth slows and you're seeing less of that kind of just expansion generally of opportunities, that makes the relative mobility story more important. So if you like, I'm borrowing someone else's analogy, Steve Pearlstein, who writes for The Post, so that there's a big difference between being overtaken on a highway when everyone's going 60 miles an hour, between being cut off by someone when everyone's gridlocked. And I quite like that because it sort of seems to capture this sense of like when the economy's growing, when everyone's getting better off and everyone's better off than their parents were, then maybe there's less kind of angst or difficult politics around the fact that there's perpetuation at the top, right? If everyone's getting better off, maybe we don't care so much if we're not moving around. Maybe. I still would, because that's my view about fairness. But I think now we're getting to a point where the relative mobility thing is going to matter a lot more for precise reasons you identified, because the economy is not creating more room at the top in a way that it was before. And at the same time, the people at the top are doing a better and better job of hoarding the opportunities for their own children so that they don't fall. And I think the kind of politics of that are going to get really interesting over the next few decades, because I don't think we're going to get back to post-war growth rates anytime soon.
And just to speaker's prerogative here, as you know, Richard, and as I'm sure everybody in this room knows, we're in a city where until the Great Recession, the growth was the norm,
right,
and faster growth than any other city in the country. And when that comes crashing to a halt, you're forced to take a look at some things that you literally
right,
may not have time to when you're growing.
Right, or maybe don't matter as much. Right, but they matter a lot more when we're not growing.
Sir?
One of your charts showed the relative mobility in various cities.
Mm-hmm.
What about areas that are non-city areas in the Middle West or even Pennsylvania, whatever, that are non-cities?
So from my memory of the research, they're mostly kind of somewhere in the middle. Most of the action at the extremes is in the cities, so the really low mobility areas were some of the big southern metros, and the higher mobility areas tended to be some of the northern metros or places like Salt Lake City. So the rural areas didn't explain much of the difference. And actually, in terms of commuting zones, I can't remember what the number is now, but the overwhelming majority of the US population live in those metro areas anyway. So in terms of explaining the overall picture. So the rural areas were neither kind of outliers at the top or the bottom. The action's in the cities.
Here?
I was just going to actually reveal my cards before I ask the question. But my brother and I, we had the same amount of education. I would say that we have about equal grit and perseverance and determination. He chose a path or a profession that he makes 10 times more than I do.
Mm-hmm.
I work in the arts. I'm
Mm-hmm.
in the College of Fine Arts. I wouldn't trade places with him in
Right.
a second. I mean,
Right.
the part of the assumption that I see is that income is really the sole indicator of the good life, right? I mean,
Right.
there's other things that factor into having a rich, meaningful life that we may be overlooking.
Okay. So Carol Graham, who also comes out here a lot, does a lot of work on this at Brookings. But I'll give you a kind answer, and then I'll give you a really sharp answer. Okay, how about that? Right. So the kind answer is, of course, you're right. You know, it's crazy just to say income's doing it. There's all kinds of other factors. So here I am with my graphs, and it just assumes that it was all about income. And why am I only measuring income? It could be well-being, or job satisfaction, or quality of family life, or quality of, or a whole series of other things, right? And then the sharp thing I'll say is that only people who are above a certain income threshold ever say that. You know, you're right, but there's a danger that tends to be something that kind of people who are doing okay, right? So you say you're working out, so I've got no idea what your income is, and I've got a graph in my essay where I can put you on the percentile distribution. But people are always shocked to know how high up the income distribution they are. Well, what's your income?
Can't say that.
Right, so just if you look at the graph, you'll do it, right? But roughly, according to the Chetty data, the household income required to get you into that top quintile is just over $100,000 a year. Okay, so we all look at the people around us, our own family members, our own kind of communities, and we benchmark ourselves against them, right? It's one of the reasons why more money doesn't make people happier, because they just compare themselves to other people who are their neighbours. So I agree with you at one level, and here's the thing. If I'm convinced that the reason why some of these people are not upwardly mobile from the bottom is because they're like you, or they're in the middle and they've dropped down or whatever, and they've chosen a career in the arts, which, by the way, is the most downwardly mobile thing people ever do. So nursing, most upwardly mobile thing to do. A career in the arts or museums, the most downwardly mobile thing to do.
I have to ask where public policy experts.
I don't know, but probably down. If I was convinced that the reason we were getting those mobility patterns was because all these people were saying, yeah, you know what, I could go to a great college and, you know, be a Wall Street lawyer, but I decided to do something else, be a potter instead, right? If I'm convinced that's what's happening, I'm out of here, I'm done, job done, I'm not worrying. I'm a very long way from being convinced that's what's happening. A very, very long way from being convinced. So I think for the moment anyway, income is doing a pretty good job of telling me what's happening about the persistence of kind of inequality over generations, right? So I would say that you are the exception, not the rule. And you should stop complaining. Actually, you weren't complaining. That's totally unfair. You weren't, right? But let's be careful who we're comparing ourselves to. That's what I would say.
Sir?
You mentioned race and continuous marriage status of the mother. What about gender?
There are gender differences, and they're in the expected direction that men are more likely to be upwardly mobile than women. But that gap is narrowing quite quickly. And I expect that as more data comes in, it will narrow further because of the rapid entry of women into college in particular, and what's happening to that. So there is a gender gap. Also, one of the problems with it is getting at the income, right? So we tend to measure household income, so then it's really hard to know what's going on, because let's say you're a woman who forms a household with a man who's very high earning, then actually your household income is going to be, so you've done great in terms of household, even though you haven't actually done very well. So it's actually quite difficult to know what's going on. But in terms of earnings and so on, I expect that gap will continue to narrow. I don't think, this is not to say there isn't a lot more to do in terms of gender equality, especially at the top, but it is to say in terms of mobility anyway, that's a problem that seems to be improving, whereas a lot of the others don't.
Sir, we'll get to you.
Very quickly, can you elaborate on any relation between character traits and family income? Does the high family income and the sort of success that it suggests improve the character traits and then contribute to
That's a great question. It's both. It seems to be both in both directions. So it seems as if being raised in a kind of higher income family, more affluent kind of family, creates the space and resources and maybe the motivation as well to work quite hard at inculcating those character strengths. Those character strengths in turn predict your own success. So there's a kind of, so I think causality runs both ways. Yeah, but also kind of think, I just read a very interesting paper on parenting, and what I think is happening is that affluent parents have really noticed that there are high returns to human capital in the economy and to developing skills, and they mean cognitive skills, but also non-cognitive skills as well. And also, more affluent parents are parenting very intensively, much more intensively than they were in the past. And that gap in parenting intensity is huge across the income distribution as well. So I think kind of affluent marriages are becoming like these kind of incredible child-rearing factories, incredibly effective. So I should be honest, I've got children, and we're kind of just investing so heavily in our own kids on both the cognitive and the non-cognitive side. We're just equipping them across the board. And so the reason I worry about that is because that's, if you like, that's another nail in the coffin of the idea that birth isn't destiny.
In the back, sir?
Yes, I was curious about the regional pattern in social mobility, that you indicated that southern cities like Charlotte and Atlanta had less social mobility than other areas of the country. Is there anything that explains that? Because, I mean, for instance, with Atlanta, I don't know what the impact of the recent recession has been on Atlanta, but Atlanta has the image of a relatively prosperous southern city. So what explains lack of social mobility?
It's a great question, and I would, if you're interested in that, I'd point you not only at the Chetty work, but the New York Times did a wonderful interactive map where you can kind of click on and see just across the whole of the US what the mobility rates are in different places. So I'll give you a very quick answer, but then I suggest you go there. It looks as if so Atlanta seems prosperous at one level, and in the southern cities, Charlotte's similar, I think, is that you've got quite a prosperous and quite an affluent kind of layer, if you like, on those cities. But you've got a very poor and intergenerationally poor group kind of below them. And so it may be that our perception of a city is biased towards the kind of high growth, more affluent bits of it, particularly if we are, if that's the world that we live in. And it does look as if in the southern cities in particular, segregation and racial segregation by geography is a huge factor around upward mobility. So the Chetty data finds that the degree of racial segregation is one of the biggest correlations with lack of upward mobility. The more segregated a city is, the less upward mobility they have. It's one of the strongest findings from the Chetty data. And the southern cities are still, relative to other cities, much more geographically segregated along racial lines. And that has a whole series of consequences for school quality, concentrated poverty, etc. So kind of policies to kind of do much better in terms of racial mix seem to be good for mobility as well. So there's lots else going on, but that's the big finding. Southern cities are racially segregated, and that seems to hamper upward mobility.
I'll ask a question, sir.
Yes. Regarding your social mobility and some regional issues, do you think it's possible to link some kind of social mobility and the geographic mobility of parents' generation and or the young adult generation? So for instance, one control group will be those who never left their hometown versus those who moved to the other part of the country. How the social mobility has been impacted by those geographic mobility.
Right. I mean within the United States? Mobility, geographical mobility within the United States. You're not talking about immigration. Okay. So there is going to be some more work on that out of the Chetty project, which looks at when people move, is it where the kids were for most of their childhood that predicts their mobility, or where they ended up? And I don't know the answer to that question yet, and I'm kind of waiting for their results. But it looks as if there's a big impact from where the kids were raised. So if you spent most of your childhood in one area, that seems to have a big effect on where you end up. The great difficulty, of course, is the parents who move are a self-selected sample, right? They're not representative. The people who up sticks and go to get another opportunity are a very different kind of parent, probably, to the parents who just shrug their shoulders and say, well, there's nothing to be done. And controlling for that difference is incredibly difficult. I will say, though, that one of the things that drove social mobility, arguably up until maybe the 60s, certainly up until the beginning of the early bit of the 20th century, was geographical mobility, right? So the US was just like, everyone was moving everywhere all the time. So that kind of sense of constant geographical movement actually allowed for more upward mobility, because you just go to where the jobs were, an opportunity. But geographical mobility within the states has really dropped. in the last 10 to 20 years, so particularly interstate mobility. Now, not true here. I've looked at the data for here. There's a lot here, but generally across the US, people are not moving geographically anything like as much as they did in the past. And I think that's having a depressing effect on social mobility as well. And that might be for good reasons, because they like where they live, right? It's a great, lovely community, or the parents are there, or whatever. Could be for good reasons in that you've got 2 careers now. So you can't, if you've got both, if both of you are working, you can't just up sticks so easily maybe and go. It may be that people are less willing to pull their kids out of school and just go somewhere else because they're so invested in their kids' education. We don't know. But we do know that geographical mobility rates have come down a lot, and I suspect that's having a knock-on effect on social mobility.
Just one question.
Sure.
Well,
I'm okay.
the direction of causality between social mobility and geographical mobility, what do you expect? Which
Between geographical mobility and social
it
mobility?
can be interpreted in both ways, right?
You can interpret it both ways, that's right. I do think that one of the other factors hindering social mobility is that if a property market where the jobs are gets so overheated, it means that people who would like to go there to get a job can't afford to go there. And so that has knock-on effects as well. And so kind of thinking about land use and kind of affordable housing becomes a huge issue too. And as housing, obviously there was the crash, but before the crash, the overheating of lots of property markets was a very big hindrance to people being able to move into the areas where the opportunity was. In order to seize the opportunity, you have to be able to live there. That has big effects too, because if you come from an affluent family, they'll probably help you find somewhere to live, whereas if you come from a low-income family, they ain't going to help you buy an apartment in New York, right? That takes money. And so there's a danger there that's another factor in this intergenerational transmission.
Right.
I'm happy for time. I'm all right for time if people want to.
Sir, and then you, man? Yeah.
Richard, I wonder if you would comment on, does the American dream require a certain dose of the frontier spirit in the context of a couple of observations I've seen in my profession working in the high net worth, ultra high net worth space, where family A can afford to throw tutors and personal coaches, et cetera, at children to ensure that they do what they need to do in time for, getting things done and getting out college applications out, et cetera, versus a kid who does not have, or a family that does not have those resources. So is the answer to that question that a certain dose of frontier spirit is required from sort of one socioeconomic side of the strata versus the other?
Well, I certainly think that to the extent that getting skills is helpful for being upwardly mobile, they will be more valuable to those who are at the bottom, because they're the ones who obviously are the ones who want to be being more upwardly mobile. So if the question is it even more important in a sense to develop those skills, both cognitive and non-cognitive, for those from disadvantaged backgrounds, my answer would be yes. But I'd also say that I think more affluent parents are working on those skills with their kids as well. They are actually working pretty hard. All the evidence is that kind of like, the application of consistent rules and discipline, and control, etc., is part of, being a kind of engaged parent. So I think that to the extent that those skills will predict their kids' life chances, you can bet that that's what affluent parents are doing as well. They're not just getting their kids smart, they're also trying to teach them to learn to defer gratification, stick with the task, moderate their own emotions, etc. Those are skills that. So there's a danger that the people who, in a sense, is true of like the college education thing. Almost, there's a maldistribution of those resources.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm not sure if it's relevant to these studies that you're talking about, but if you look at the women's movement, it seems that the women just suddenly stood up and said, we're doing this. They forced their way in. It wasn't that there was suddenly economic or intellectual opportunity. They demanded it.
Right.
What suddenly allowed them to do that?
Well, you're outside my area of expertise. But I would say that this founding ideal of equality, which of course was not extended to women at the founding, and it certainly wasn't extended to black Americans for a very long time. But nonetheless, I think once you're saying this is a question of natural equality, there is no reason why we should deny a woman the chance to do the same thing as a kind of man, right? I think once a social or an economic question gets framed in that kind of sense of being born equal, regardless of gender, race, etc., then the debate changes. And my completely unempirical theory about same-sex marriage is that really started motoring when it became branded as equal marriage. Right? There's an interesting debate about the framing of this, right? Are you in favour of gay marriage, which is what the opponents would keep saying, or are you in favour of equal marriage? So it's equal marriage. It's very difficult to oppose, actually, because then you're sort of saying, are we going to deny that person the right to marry just because their sexuality is that? And I think the same thing happened with feminism. I think it's just there's a certain point where it just feels morally wrong to deny a certain group of people the same rights as another group of people.
Yeah, I just meant that it came from the indigenous population, not from the society allowing. They forced their way in, and now the gays are forcing their way in to the
Right.
equality.
Right.
We're going to stick around for a few minutes if
Yes,
you have.
this lady has been dying to get in for
Oh,
a very long
please.
time,
All right.
so I'm conscious of
Absolutely.
time, but I'm also aware
You're
that she's
sitting
been-
in the front row, absolutely.
I share the lights probably. The thing that really caught my eye was the crayon test. And this lecture was very descriptive rather than prescriptive. But do you think at some point this study is going to ask questions of, obviously there's trust issues, but how to not equalize that, but lower that barrier in order to raise a certain demographic up? And besides throwing money at a situation in terms of, well, the solution is X amount of dollars, what else do you think might help in raising the trust of, just raising
Right.
trust?
So I think I can be much more prescriptive, but I wasn't tonight. So I think there are policies that we can engage in, but I think you're asking a deeper question, which is, do the young people that we're most worried about, i.e. the ones who are in those bottom quintiles, right, do they trust that there are opportunities available to them if they seek them out? Do they trust society? Do they believe in the American dream? Do they trust that if they do the right thing, the good things will follow for them? And I think the answer is, for too many, the answer is no. And for too many, they're not wrong in some cases to think that. And so and this is where I think the whole debate about personal responsibility is really, really quite important to get right. So I think that we have a collective responsibility to give people something to trust in. And that means they need more visible role models, they need more salience, they need to see alternative futures for themselves, they need to think that college is for somebody like me, right? Those jobs are for somebody like me. So all of that has to happen. Then the quality of their educational environment has to be dissociated from the zip code they happen to be born into, right? So they don't feel like they're second-class citizens because we're giving them a second-class education, right? It's quite hard to say to young people, no, you're not a second-class education, even though they can look around them and see the quality of their education compared to others. And so whilst I strongly agree that each of us has a responsibility to be as good parents as possible and to do the best ourselves and to seize the opportunities that are there for us. So that's where the kind of personal responsibility rhetoric is right. On the other hand, I think we have a collective responsibility to ensure that there are real opportunities within the realistic grasp of those young people as well. This is not our responsibility to solve poor people's problems, and nor is it the responsibility of those who are in disadvantaged circumstances to pull themselves up by the bootstraps as if by magic. We have a shared responsibility to both create opportunities and seize them. And it seems to me that's the individualist egalitarianism that's at the heart of the American dream, and it's the breaking of that promise for so many of our citizens that's, I think, storing up trouble for the future. I think we have an opportunity to turn the corner, but we better seize it fast.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank all of you for coming out tonight, your patience and your great questions. I told Richard this would be a test for him, and it
right.
was. I think he passed his own test here. Hope you can join us next week. Our next lecture will be Wednesday. Colleague John Hudak will be back. John has a solution to fix the U.S. Congress. I know.
He does.
And
He's fantastic, by the way.
And I'm going to
He's
tell you
really
what
good.
his solution is, since it's in the title of the lecture. John's going to propose that earmarks are the solution to fixing the U.S. Congress. So come on back and see how we've come full circle.